Good evening, Alaskans. Your wilderness is one of the most beautiful in the world, yet also one of the most dangerous. Tonight, we'll share 10 true creepy stories of hikers who vanished across Alaska. Stories that will leave you uneasy, about the trails you thought you knew. And remember, many people watch these videos without subscribing. Don't make that mistake. The next stories will be even scarier. Let's begin. They gave me a laminated map that creased white at the folds and a cheap radio with my name misspelled on the masking tape at the back. In the gravel lot, somebody set out a folding table with store-brand granola bars and foam cups of instant soup steam drifting sideways through fog. Carla, the coordinator, handed me an orange vest that smelled like a wet garage and said, "Shoulder season means the trail wants to be two things at once." I nodded like I'd always understood weather, with an attitude. The missing hiker was 33, a quiet regular at lap swim, last seen 4 days ago. I'd met his sister at the pool. She did steady laps and stopped at each wall the way someone stops at a sentence they have to read twice. His name was Theo. The email blasts made it look delicate. There'd been a voicemail, they said, breathing, then wind chimes. No words. I came because I had time and because not coming would have left me with a louder apartment. We started behind the water plant where the Chugach foothills shrug up from storage yards and the smell of wet cardboard. The faded hatchback with the thumbprint dent sat by a posted map, wipers frozen mid-gesture. The trail out of the lot was shoulder season, half slush, half mud, roots slick as eelbacks. Fog had the nerve to cancel the horizon. Our team was me, Don, a retired math teacher who told jokes he didn't finish, and 2 college kids from a wilderness class, jackets stiff like they'd just peeled off store hangers. Don carried the GPS in a zip bag with an old pasta label still clinging to the plastic. Carla drew a rectangle on the laminated map with a dry erase marker and wrote F inside it. "Creek to old ski line and up toward the radio tower if you feel good," she said. "Mark every split, no hero business." She pressed a roll of blue flagging tape into my hand. "Tie it clean so we can all read you." I'd used flagging before, spring work parties where crews fling color into the woods to warn the woods what's coming. You tie it on your way in so you can follow your way out. It's a promise to strangers you'll never meet. I was here. You can be here safely too. The college kids walked like they were trying to please a rubric. Don walked like someone who had measured distances on paper. Fog chewed sound down until the only noises were breath, boots, and the thin zipper hiss of our rain jackets. We called out Theo, at the intervals the briefing had suggested, then listened to the trees answer with what wasn't his name. The first blue ribbon we hadn't tied was on a spruce at a 4-way muddle, where game trails braided with footpaths. It was fresh, edges sharp, no dirt. North side of the trunk, shoulder height, a neat square knot. Not ours. Don touched it with 2 fingers like you touch a photograph. "Trail crew?" one kid offered. "Not this week," Don said. They canceled for weather. The fog made a small room around us and the ribbon sat in it like an idea. I ripped a strip from our roll, bit it to tear, and tied our own marker higher up. The knot felt like tucking, hair behind an ear. I meant it to say we were moving through, not stopping to stare. 20 minutes later, a second strip of that same blue appeared on a spur the map didn't bother to acknowledge, a narrow run through flattened tundra grass. This one was lower, knee-height, snugged like someone disliked loose ends. A single chime sounded somewhere above us, a small bell with a short patience. "From a yard?" I said. Don glanced up into fog like it owed him a fence line. "No, houses this high." We stayed on our grid. Search rules are the bones that keep the day standing straight. At a bench of ground where a rotten picnic table slumped into ferns, Don blew 3 notes on the whistle. In fog, it sounded like childhood lost in a coat rack. Carla came through the radio reminding everyone, if it looks placed, not dropped, mark it and call. Someone in another sector discussed a glove by the creek, wet inside and out, probably nothing. The bell rang again, softer like a spoon on a thin glass. We tried to follow the sound, but sound in fog migrates without papers. Ahead, to the right, above, then behind, like we were walking a circle without deciding to. We found boot prints that tried not to be. No clean tread, just smears of pressure. That couldn't commit. One kid crouched for a photo. His phone decided it was dusk. "He wears a 9, I said, because I'd read the sister's form. Don grunted. Sizes are guesses in mud. By noon, we were damp through. We split a sleeve of crackers. When I stepped 30 feet off trail to pee, I saw down in the young growth another ribbon tied low enough that kneeling would help. 20 feet beyond it, another, lower still, tucked in the fork of a sapling the color of wet bone. It made a path, but not for walking upright. It made a path for someone who already knew where they were going. We went together. Don checked the GPS because that made it official. He called base and said our voices slow so we wouldn't sound like kids, telling ghost stories. Unlogged flagging, placed low, leading away from marked trail, investigating 12 to 15 meters. While he spoke, the bell chimed once from above us this time, and a breath arrived in the speaker with the swagger of someone who didn't know about protocols. Not static, human air. Then silence, the kind that looks at you. We backed to the trail by mutual, unspoken vote. On the way, we passed another blue strip, crisp, pointing back toward the bench as if to say, "Stand here to see them when they come." That night, I washed the trail off my hands and couldn't find a way to wash the day off anything else. The apartment windows filmed over. The parking lot lamps became smudged metals. I microwaved noodles, failed to taste. I tried not to text anyone something dramatic. When I finally slept, I dreamed of blue ribbons tied to chairbacks in a classroom, each pointing not to a door but to where someone had sat to watch me working. In the morning, the fog had settled heavier, honest about wanting to be a ceiling. We were not a mile in when the next blue ribbon that wasn't ours showed. Shoulder, height on a thin alder, the knot with a thumb smoothness that felt personal. 10 steps later, another on a dead hemlock, white wood showing like bone through peeling coats. "They're marking us," I said, finally saying the thing my mouth had been avoiding. Don didn't argue. He stood where someone would stand to watch 3 people go by and study the sight lines. The curve of trail, the window through branches, the way our bright vests became moving beads. We tried following the offshoot the strip suggested. It ended after 15 yards in brush that had never been asked to accept people. We could have forced it. It would have turned us into a story about when people got lost looking for someone already lost. We didn't. At the second switchback, yesterday's sign wore a new ribbon lower down the post, like a calibration had been made by someone fine-tuning a machine. We paused there because you pause where a day insists. The radio crackled, no voices, a breath. Then the chime, 1, 2, close together, not melody, just the sound of metal remembering it was meant to ring. "Sector F to base," Don said. "Unknown transmission, possibly cross-channel interference." He stayed professional while the speaker warmed my hip with someone else's lungs. Back at the lot, the trooper chewed a peppermint like a pencil, wrote rectangles around nouns. Carla and Don spoke privately in the language of people who need their words to stack like lumber. The sister caught my eye and said, "They traced the last voicemail to the tower by the foothills. They think the breath is his." She gave me a brittle smile. "It's always his breath." She added, lower. "The chime? He took my grandmother's little bell when he moved. Put it on his back porch. It never stopped," she said, as if a sound could be a habit. I said the safest word I had. "Okay." It meant nothing and everything. On the third day, the radio felt warm in my hand before I turned it on, as if it had already been talking without me. Carla gave us the same sector. Being sent back felt like both trust and punishment. "Phones misdial when they're wet," she said. "If you get a call from his number, note the time and keep searching." The hill received us the way automatic doors open for everyone. For an hour, we got nothing but our own blue knots where we'd been yesterday. My ties a little too high. Don's flat and calm. The kids off to one side whenever the branch was bare. Then the new blue reappeared like a person who had waited for us to warm up. It pointed uphill into a part of the fog that felt like drywall. "Return to known trail," Don said to me, not the radio. I looked upslope and saw nothing. I looked at where the ribbon invited me to stand. From that spot, if I imagined the fog gone and the branches lifted, I could picture the switchback below, the little open flat where we had stood, the sign with its ridiculous hat. I could picture our bodies as figures in a window. "I'll check 10 feet, I said, the kind of lie that sounds like a measurement. Don started to say visual range, and then swallowed the phrase because the fog had already turned visual into a joke. I stepped off the trail into duff that gave like a mattress for someone memorized. 10 feet became 12 because distance has a sense of humor in weather. A second ribbon weighted low on a spruce stub. I squatted and the world opened a narrow corridor of view, a spy hole through green. I could see Don, the kids, their hoods like quotation marks. I could feel exactly where a person would stand on my side to watch them without being watched. And that knowledge stood up the hair on my arms like it wanted to see better. The radio breathed. The chime sounded once, then again, not quite the same note twice. My mouth filled with the taste of cold metal. A third ribbon flashed left, tied to a young birch with bark peeling in strips you could write errands on. It pointed east, which in fog is a kind of faith. I moved toward it and my foot slid into a shallow hole, mud swallowing me, gentle and humiliating. I swore softly. The branches made a lattice just tall enough to fit a person who knew how not to touch anything. Ahead, a boulder with a cap of old moss hid a narrow drainage chute. Somebody had tied a ribbon to a root that made a handle above it. Downslope, the world turned to a graded gray like a chalkboard you weren't invited to write on. Maps have edges because paper does. The chute had none. In my pocket, the laminated map crackled like a bag of chips. In front of me, the tape spoke a word that wasn't a word. I could still see the others. I could still undo this sentence. "I'll tag it and come back," I called, which is like saying I'll go to the edge of the roof but not think of falling. I slid a few feet down the chute, mud pipe organ smooth. From there, a low tunnel under spruce limbs offered another corridor. A fourth ribbon, then a fifth, each tied at a height you'd use if you wanted a view from a particular angle, as if sight itself could be tuned. I didn't step back. I didn't yet step forward. The chute held my boots like a hand, curious which way I'd lean. If I moved left 2 paces, I'd probably get a view of the old trailhead, the pre-cut line from a few years ago that still remembers feet. If the fog lifted even a little, you could watch a white car roof blink between alders from there. You could watch 3 volunteers cross a bench of ground and touch a sign. The 6th ribbon waited beyond, a little higher, like standing on a stair. The radio gave me only my own breathing ghosted back at me. Then the chime struck once and was done, as if the air were too crowded for ring. I understood a second big thing. These ribbons were not marking a way through. They were marking rooms, places to stand and watch. Whoever tied them had found vantage points the map didn't have names for. The grammar was angle, height, how the knot sat in its tail. "Come back," Don said, closer now. Sensible verbs. He was patient like people are when they see a future they don't want. I looked at the ribbon ahead. It made an offer without pressure. I took 1 step and put my fingertips on the damp cloth. Cold traveled into my palm like a little letter. It pointed off the map. For a beat, I felt the whole hill lean in. Not physically, just that press inside your ribs when a choice looks at you. I thought of the sister at the pool, braid dark with chlorine touching the wall, listening to the world ask her to continue. I thought of the hatchback with the thumbprint dent, the supermarket granola bars, the way the fog had eaten even the smallest sound. I thought of the voicemail they'd played over and over because the only thing inside it was a human fact. Breath. I stood with my toes dug in and felt how the chute wanted me. "Now," Don said, not loud. The radio breathed, like a sleeping animal. I stepped back, and then another step, and the ribbon tails brushed my knees like a polite crowd letting me through. When I reached the trail, the kids each exhaled, as if they'd been hoping I'd join their version of the day. We marked the spot with orange, logged the coordinates, and walked out at a pace that pretended we weren't leaving anything unfinished. At base, the trooper made another rectangle. Carla said we'd expand the sector tomorrow. Draw an F-prime like you grow. A backyard fence into brush. The sister stood with her hands buried in her sweatshirt pocket like there were fragile things in there. I told her nothing about the corridor of rooms or the way the 8th ribbon had angled itself into absence. She didn't ask. When I got home, I found a fleck of blue stuck to my glove. I rinsed my hands, and the sink made the smell of cold iron. I dried the fleck and slipped it into a little resealable bag, the way you'd keep a tooth you wanted to stop thinking about. The message came an hour later. 11 seconds. Breathing. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone practicing. Then one chime. Not quite the pitch from the hill. And a rough scrape as if wood kissed bark and thought better of it. No words. I replayed it twice and then stopped. Not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I didn't want my walls to learn it. Outside, fog leaned its head on the window and listened. The search went on the next morning, because our way of believing in one another is to walk where we'd rather not. The map had new rectangles. Ribbons appeared where we would stand. The bell came when we weren't expecting it and did not come when we whistled. We found a circle in the duff with 2 knee prints and joked, thinly, that a moose had prayed there. We found nothing you could build a ceremony around. In the late afternoon, on my way back to town, I pulled into the turnout where sometimes the gray block stack of buildings looks like a toy city you could move by hand. I couldn't see anything, but the idea of it. A spruce with a lightning scar stood by the guardrail, its bark split into 2 different stories. On the north side, at shoulder height, a new blue ribbon waited that none of us had put there. Its tail lay against the trunk, wet and ordinary. It pointed not to any trail, but toward a fold of hillside where fog nested like laundry. I stood, there with my engine ticking and the radio silent in my jacket. A car came up the road and slowed and kept going. Somewhere in the trees, something small struck something smaller, and made a sound like a bell taking a breath. The ribbon held still, as if being watched. I thought of the map tucked in the cup holder, edges worn from being folded and unfolded as if paper could learn a mountain's intentions. I thought of how the rooms in the woods had been arranged for someone who liked to know how people moved when they thought they were alone. Night happens in 2 ways here. Suddenly, and again. As the first way started, I reached up and touched the ribbon just enough to see it darken under my finger. Cold traveled into my hand like a reminder. I didn't untie it. I didn't take it. I let it point where it wanted. Then I got back in the car, turned the heat on low, and listened to the blower stumble before it settled into its one job. The hill remained ahead, and the fog continued its long, careful work of making the edges soft. The radio on the seat next to me breathed once, a quiet, uncommitted sigh, and stilled. And somewhere beyond the printed map, and the part where the trail pretends to end, a final ribbon waited on a branch bowed to accept it, pointing where there is nothing on paper and everything in weather, and in that direction a person stood and watched until watching was the same as being found. We left Fairview later than planned because Mara wanted one more battery check and I wanted one more coffee. The plan was simple. Chase the forecasted aurora, get a few long exposures near the low run of the pipeline where the hills fold down, and be back before dawn made us liars. She said the sky only tells the truth to people who meet it halfway. I said the road tells its own truth whether you listen or not. We laughed the way you do when you don't expect anything to answer back. The Dalton at night is a factory line. Even when it looks empty, the road hums, the pipeline hums, your teeth hum because you've joined the system. Rigs swept past now and then, throwing snow into sheets that flashed and fell. The weather band on the radio kept losing itself and returning with the same tired voice. Falling temperatures, north wind, maintenance scheduled near mile marker 187. We listened, said okay, and kept driving because people always keep driving until they can't. We turned into the pullout a little after 1. The aluminum marker 187 had been drilled with bullets so often the numbers looked like constellations. The pipeline rode high to our left like a whale's back. I idled the truck and killed the headlights. Heat smelled like pennies and mouse dust. The engine ticked to itself and settled. Mara set up with the efficient fidgeting of experience, tripod legs squeaking in the cold, cable release clipped by habit, knit hat tugged down to turn her into a different, sharper version of herself. We worked by the small laws of our hobby. She spoke settings. I pretended I already knew them. The first light was a green pencil line testing the paper. She took cautious frames and we waited together, shoulders touching through too many layers. Wind kept close to the ground, a smart dog that didn't want attention. The bigger sound was the underlying one, a cold, deep thrum that felt like the road thinking. The sky unrolled. Green thickened and then tore into lace. She laughed once, a sound that went up and didn't come back. I wanted to say something good and said nothing. Then, the tapping. At first I thought it was the truck, a plastic panel adjusting, some old clip finding its seat. 3 small knocks, pause, 2 small knocks, long pause. I clicked my tongue back, without meaning to. The night held its breath, then gave us the same 3 knocks from somewhere low and not the truck. We turned toward the road together because we are animals who look toward pattern. The highway crossed a shallow gully there by way of a corrugated metal culvert, the kind every county buys from the same catalog. Frost feathered its rim in delicate plates that felt wrong next to galvanized steel. Wind-scoured gravel had drifted against the lip like a pile of small bones. Mara pressed her mitten to the metal and said, bewildered and plain, "It's warmer than the air." We crouched. Our headlamps slid along the corrugations and died a yard in, as if light didn't have the right to proceed. The tapping came again. 3. Pause 2. Long pause. Not echoing. Tucked away. The kind of sound a room makes rather than a pipe. "Culvert ice," I said, because it's important to try a reasonable story first. She didn't argue. She said hello into the opening like passing a note in class. The knocks answered with the patience of someone teaching you a game they already know. A feeling walked over my scalp and down my arms that I've only had when big animals changed, the size of the world. I wanted someone whose job was to be awake out here. We went back to the truck and I keyed the old radio. A woman answered on the 3rd try with a voice that sounded like fluorescent light. I told her our mile marker, our situation, and the part where it felt like something waited inside the culvert. I left out the warmth. She said a trooper was close enough to swing by. Close means different things here. I set the mic in its claw and let the truck idle. The cab smelled sharper now, like copper. On the corner of the windshield, the frost had smeared into a pale handprint traveling toward the steering wheel. Maybe. The heater did that, I told myself. Maybe my brain did. Mara stared through the glass as if it wanted to be something else. We crossed the road to the far mouth and made the first marks on that side. Behind us, our footprints ended where the wind-scoured gravel refused all record. The second rim wore the same frost filigree. I touched the metal and believed her. Warmer than the air? Not warm, just less cruel. Breath made a lace of steam that drifted into the opening and didn't return. Headlights topped the rise to the south, steady and white. The cruiser swung in with neat care. Trooper Haynes introduced himself like a man who always keeps gear in the same places. He asked if we were stuck, if anyone was hurt, and listened without flinching when we told him we'd heard tapping from the culvert like a person using patience as a key. "You didn't go in," he said, half statement, half approval. He lay down, with the tidy disrespect of someone who has done this too many times, and slid his shoulders into the mouth to his elbows. He didn't say hello. He knocked 3 times with his knuckle. The reply came as if it had been itching to be asked. 3. Pause 2. He turned his head to offer one ear, and his face did a small private thing that made me colder. "If someone is in there," he said, gentle like coaxing a kid. "Tap once if you can hear me." 1 knock, polite. 2 if you're alone. 2 knocks. "You hurt?" Pause long enough for embarrassment, then 2 again, as if he'd asked the wrong question and the answer refused to change. He eased back, brushed frost from his sleeves, and looked not pale but less detailed, like a copy of himself. "It imitates," he said. "Don't give it a pattern to keep." We didn't know what to do with that. We stood while the hum under everything found corners. Haynes fetched a pry bar and a coil of rope from his trunk, clipped the rope to his belt, and handed me a narrow flashlight like he was knighting me for steadiness. "If I ask you to pull, do it steady," he said. He slid in again and rapped once without waiting for answer. His voice came back padded. "It widens a hair," he said. "There's a turn that doesn't make sense." The rope paid out slowly. The aurora thinned to a long bruise. Our truck idled across the road with its lights off, a breathing shape. I watched the coil with the pointless intensity of a man counting a fever. The rope went slack so gently it took a second to notice. "Haynes?" I said. The rope pulled twice against my palm like a handshake and then lay still. "Nobody answer," he said from inside. "No matter what it knocks." He didn't ask. Mara put her mitten over my hand. We held the line together, two polite people holding the idea of a person. A maintenance truck approached from the north, orange, beacon sweeping lazy arcs. It slowed for us and idled by the culvert as if summoned. The driver leaned out, face pale in the dash glow. "Everything okay?" he called. Haynes wormed backward and stood dusted with frost, composed enough to be boring. "Possible obstruction," he said. "We're assessing." The new man climbed down with the contained caution of people who lift for a living. He peered into the mouth and chuckled. Frost jackal talk, especially late winter. The pipe knocked back in a rhythm that had no interest in learning his lines. Haynes's hand hovered at the man's sleeve. "Humor me," he said. "Let it be." We might have. We might have refused the impulse to play. But I made a small ruinous mistake. Inside the cab, to show Mara how close the sound felt, I tapped once on the windshield. The pain gave under my knuckle not as glass gives but like a drum tightened, with skin. The truck ticked as if cooling even though it wasn't. "Don't answer it," Haynes said, not turning. But the night had permission now. It stepped forward the way a large person steps onto an old porch. The hum acquired corners. The road became a belt, the pipeline a spine, the pull-out a bay in a factory we hadn't known we'd entered. "Inventory," a thought said in a voice that was not entirely mine. Haynes knelt and spoke into the opening. "I'm going to ask questions. Nobody else knocks. 3 for yes." The pipe obliged. He asked about water, about space to turn, about cold, about light. The replies were neat and patient. Then he asked, "How many feet?" The answer was wrong immediately. It scattered like thrown gravel and then settled as 2. "2," Mara whispered, head tilted, as if confirming a price. A glow bloomed on the horizon, stalled, and went away, a truck that never arrived. In the passenger mirror, a bowed shape appeared behind our idling. Truck and slid off when I looked, the way something small runs behind the shed when you step into your own yard at night. The rope in my hands quivered, slackened, and crept forward an inch on its own. "Hold," I told it as if it could be scolded. It listened like a pet deciding how much of your request is required. The maintenance man said, "If someone's stuck, we've got winches." The pipe answered with 3 quick taps, then 3, eager. He took a step before Haynes caught his sleeve. The struggle in the man's shoulders looked like pride, duty, and a deep need to be good at what he was good at. "Not for us," Haynes said softly, and that was the bravest thing anyone did. Time lost its meter. The dispatcher's voice came, from very far away, asking for a status check, like she'd walked down a hallway and turned a corner. Haynes answered steady and asked for cones and a maintenance call, which we already had, which made the world feel circular. Frost crept along, the pipe rim in ferny arrows. Breath hung like cloth. The tapping stretched its pauses until I thought I might shout just to reset the air. We tried to leave. I put the truck in drive and pressed the gas. The engine said yes, and the chassis said no. Not a spin, a refusal. The gravel under the tires felt like a belt moving the wrong way. I took my foot back, placed it again. No. "Okay," Mara said softly, which meant not okay. Gray arrived without color. The aurora went to ash and then to nothing. The world put on ordinary like a poor disguise. Haynes wrote notes on a small pad, times names, a diagram that looked like a tray with a tube. He did not write down imitation because who would he write that for? The maintenance man lit 2 flares and failed to light a third. When it finally hissed, he stamped it out like it had insulted him. More trucks appeared in distant slices of horizon and hesitated when they saw the tableau. Cruiser, maintenance rig, our old truck breathing, 3 people standing as if waiting for a bus that did not run here. The tapping softened to a suggestion. The hum flattened. The wind came back like someone returning to a room in a house after searching the other rooms and finding nothing they wanted. We left when the crew arrived with cones and a machine that coughed gravel. Nobody vanished. No. Rope drag. Nothing for a headline beyond a lane closure and a scheduled replacement. The official words later were frost heave and resonance and old section. Papers need reasons and rooms do too. Fine. Let them have something they can say out loud. 2 weeks later, a trooper called to thank us for our statements. Not Haynes. A woman with an efficient voice who said he'd put in for coastal duty next season. Good man, she said, which is how a file gets stamped one last time. I said yes and put the phone down and put my hands on the table to keep them from knocking. On it. A month later, we drove the road again with 2 friends because people test their own locks. We didn't stop at 187. We didn't say the number. The new culvert section shone like a ring in a box. Without planning to, I flicked the high beams into the mouth as we passed. Light ran down corrugations like a ladder. There was a handprint in the frost from the inside. Small. Perfect. Slightly canted like a child trying to keep balance on a moving floor. I did not mention it. There are words that call to the wrong parts of a place. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 and talked about coffee and music and anything else. Behind us, the barricade leaned at a tired angle, as if it had been moved and moved back by people who believed in destinations more than maps. At home that winter, the drain in our cheap apartment knocked twice when the water heater kicked on. The refrigerator edited its hum at 3 in the morning and left a hole my brain fell into. Once I answered a tap without thinking, one polite knock on the counter to say I heard. The silence that followed felt like someone across the hall deciding whether to answer your door. I went very still and then I learned a new rule. I do not answer. I put cups down softly. I do not rap my knuckles on glass, even to show someone how a thing feels. When I drive, I keep the heater at 3 and my hands where they look responsible. I notice how gravel sometimes behaves like a belt. I don't tell anyone that the frost on my window at home once made the shape of digits where a child forgot to wipe after washing. I cleaned it without comment. What's left fits in a short list. A mile marker with cold coin holes. A pullout where gravel never lies right. A trooper who did everything right and moved his work to a different horizon. A maintenance man who knows one noise he won't teach. A truck that idles steady even with the key in your hand. A hum that keeps its job. Sometimes I drive past in the deep night when the sky is clean and the road feels like a dried artery. I do not stop. The pipeline does its honest work. The culvert breathes frost. The aurora, when it shows up, writes cursive and erases it. Somewhere under the asphalt, a patient pattern waits without malice or hurry, the way a building waits for occupants. It does what it does because it is what it is. I can live with that. But if I slow by habit and the engine ticks, I hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. Long pause. Not far, not close, precisely where a thing waits for you to finish the job. I keep my fingers off the glass. The heater blows. The truck breathes. The night holds its industrial breath. The last sound is the one I do not make. Outside, the pipeline hum threads the dark like a low wire, and the road seems to wait, smooth as a belt, patient as a clock between ticks, silently. The first time Matthew heard it, he thought it was wind tunneling through the spruces. He'd been alone on the trail for 3 days, following a half-melted route toward a backcountry lake that older guides called Carter's Mirror. He had come here on purpose, not for solitude exactly, but for proof. Matthew had been making these trips for years, packing a digital recorder alongside the tent and stove, trying to catch the subtler voices of nature. Wolves at night, rain on canvas, the peculiar hiss of snow shifting under its own weight. He liked the idea that sound could hold stories longer than words. But that evening, as the light went blue and the ice across the lake began to creak and settle, the sound that rose from it made his stomach clench. It wasn't cracking exactly. It was tonal, harmonized, almost like singing. He crouched near the shoreline with his recorder held out, a gust pressing icy grit against his cheek. The surface was half clear, dark bands of meltwater gliding under, the ice like ink spreading through paper. Each time the surface flexed, a long metallic tone shivered upward, drifting into another, weaving together as if some enormous instrument had been strung beneath the lake. He told himself it was just physics, stresses in the ice, the water resonating, but there was cadence there. Call and answer. Phrases that almost formed words. By the time he zipped into his sleeping bag that night, he couldn't stop replaying the snippets in his mind. He promised himself he'd check the recorder in the morning, but curiosity gnawed at him. He tugged it free from the inner pocket of his jacket, clicked play, and listened through the cheap earbuds. The tones were clearer than he remembered. In the pauses between each groan of the lake, his brain kept filling in language. Come across. Below. Wait. He ripped the buds out, laughed once too loud in the cold tent air, and set the recorder aside. Just brain tricks, like seeing faces in wood grain. But he dreamed of deep, black water pushing against the ice, as if it wanted out. In the morning the sky had cleared, a washed-out shade that felt brittle against the tree line. His boots made sharp snaps as he trudged toward the lake's edge, and he noticed his own footprints from yesterday looked softened, half swallowed overnight. He sat down on a boulder and tried the recorder again. Fresh daylight, fresh perspective. But the moment the sound spilled into his ears, the cadence was undeniable. Louder, too. The tones bent into syllables, syllables into strained words. Not his imagination this time. The phrase looped and echoed. One must come. He laughed again, but it caught in his throat. He told himself he'd hike out tomorrow, maybe flag down one of the air taxis. His brother back in Fairbanks was already joking about these trips ending badly. He didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Still, he lingered by the edge, scanning the black glass surface. That's when he saw them, tracks stretching out across the ice. Crisp boot prints wide apart as if whoever made them had walked quickly. They cut across the lake toward a darker swell where the ice thinned near the center. Matthew squinted, his breath fogging the air. No one else should have been here, not this late in the season, not with the thaw advancing. He checked the shore both ways, nothing. Checked again. The tracks were fresh, hours old at most. They pulled at him the way the recorder's words had, a line to follow. He didn't remember making a decision, only stepping off the rocks onto the ice. It gave a hollow echo beneath him, but it held. His breath hitched. He walked slowly at first, then a little faster, his own prints matching those ahead. The harmonics rose again, faint but audible without the recorder now. The surface itself seemed to hum beneath his boots, a chord shifting and opening, rising like a throat clearing. He forced himself to stop, bent low, pressed his palm against the ice. It vibrated faintly, and deep, far below, shadows seemed to tilt and move. He jerked back upright and cursed aloud. Then he saw the tracks vanish mid-lake. One last print, then nothing. Just clean black ice leading out to the meltwater patch. He staggered back, half running to the shore, stomach sour. With panic, he wanted to believe it was a trick of snowmelt, that the last prints had been erased. But he knew what he'd seen. He broke camp in silence and pushed hard down the trail the rest of that day. By the time he found the ranger station, his face was raw with windburn, his eyes bloodshot. He shoved the recorder across the counter, muttered about voices in the ice, tracks that ended. The ranger, a stout woman named Helen with a voice too calm for what he was saying, frowned but promised to send a team. 2 days later, the search party hiked in. 5 volunteers, bundled heavy against the cold. They joked at first, as people do, but quieted when the tones started. They didn't need a recorder. The ice sang for them. Long, clean harmonics that bent strangely, unsettlingly close to words. The youngest volunteer swore it said his name. Helen hushed him but walked slower after that. At the shore they found 2 sets of prints. One, Matthew's, led from the rocks and back again. The other stretched out onto the ice. They followed, carefully spaced, each step groaning. The ice held, though it looked thin enough to swallow them whole. The wind dropped. The tones grew sharp, echoing in their chests. They reached the spot where the second trail ended. There was no break, no hole, no shatter in the surface. Just the last print pressed firm into the black glass. Then nothing. One man leaned close, shading his eyes. Beneath the ice, in the wavering, dark, something pale seemed to rest. A suggestion of a face tilted upward, mouth open as if still singing. Helen called them back. They trudged to shore, silent now, each footstep booming too loud. They filed the report, words cautious, hedged, with maybes. No body, no collapse, no explanation. Just one set of tracks vanishing. The harmonics they wrote were natural ice resonance, but none of them forgot the final image. The last boot print, pressed perfect into ice that should have cracked. The lake humming like a throat. The pale shape waiting just below the ear, surface. And that night in their bunks, each of them dreamed the same sound. The voice looping clear now without distortion, telling them in plain language what it wanted. One must come. One must come. One must come. The ranger truck had barely crunched to a stop before the forest swallowed the sound again. Snow lay heavy on the spruce bog, its weight bending branches like weary men. There was no road to the cabin, just a rutted trail skirting the frozen pond, and the 3 of us, me, Carl, and young Davis, hauled the tools and propane on sleds the last half-mile. Winter maintenance was thankless, usually just clearing drifts, checking the stove, making sure the cabin still stood upright against the storms. But this time was different. The call had come down that a hiker had vanished near Raven's Rest 2 weeks ago. His family swore he'd planned to stay a night or 2. Search teams found tracks that disappeared in the snow, nothing else. Our job was only to secure the cabin, check the logbook, maybe see if there was anything to turn over to law enforcement. From a distance, the cabin looked like it always had. Dark logs, squat roof, the stovepipe like a finger stabbing at the pale sky. But as we drew closer, I smelled wood smoke. Old, damp, but recent enough that it hadn't vanished into the cold. Davis wrinkled his nose. Someone's been here. Carl just muttered, "No one should be." The door wasn't locked. It never was. Inside, the air clung warm to our faces, a lingering heat from the cast-iron stove. Not blazing, but not cold either. A single enamel cup sat on the table, ringed with brown from coffee grounds. I brushed frost from the window and found the glass faintly fogged, the way it gets when a room has held breath too long. Carl went straight for the logbook. That battered, spiral notebook every visitor was supposed to fill out. Date, name, number of nights. He flipped past the last official entry from early December, then frowned. There were pages filled after the storm had closed the trail, signed by the missing hiker's name. Each entry was neat, methodical, day after day. Stayed with the other one. Stove running, snow thick. Then on the next line, always another signature in a hand that slanted strange and uneven. The other one. Davis laughed nervously. Like a joke, right? Maybe he was lonely. His voice rang too loud in the cramped space. Carl didn't laugh. He kept turning pages slower now. Each night was documented. Sometimes the entries spoke of repairs. Other one patched the wall seam. Sometimes meals. Split beans with the other one. Always that second signature trailing underneath. "What gets me," Carl finally said, "is that there's only one cup here." He tapped the table. "Always was one. and still is. We went about the work half-heartedly, checking the stovepipe, scraping out the ashes, but our eyes kept drifting to the logbook. The final entry was dated 3 days ago, long after the search had been called off. Other one says the storm will pass soon. Other one doesn't like when I talk too loud. Then the familiar lopsided scrawl. The other one. Davis shifted uneasily, pulling his coat tighter. Someone screwing with us had to hike in during the storm, maybe squatters. But the snow around the cabin was smooth, undisturbed, not a track anywhere except our own. We decided to stay an hour, warm ourselves before hauling back. The stove ticked faintly as it cooled. Carl sat with the logbook open across his knees, frowning deep as if he could read more between the lines. I checked the cupboards, mostly empty, just a few rusted cans. The bunk still had a hollow in the blanket, like someone had lain there recently. And on the windowsill, etched faintly into the frost, was a line drawn by a fingertip. 2 crude figures, stick-shaped side by side. "Hey," I called, but Carl was muttering to himself. "It's all wrong. These entries, the handwriting, sometimes it's the same, sometimes it isn't." "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned the book to me, jabbing at the loops and slants of the letters. The hiker's neat print sometimes bent, blurred, like someone trying to imitate his hand, and the other one's scrawl sometimes curved back toward neatness, half forming the same strokes, like both signatures were tugging toward each other. A draft moved through the cabin then, though the door was shut tight. The stove gave a hollow thump like something settling inside the iron. Davis swore under his breath. "I don't like this place." We packed up fast, closing the stove and securing the shutters. But as I was pulling the door shut, I saw it. A fresh line in the logbook, written while none of us had been near it. "They came. The other one doesn't like them." And beneath, it darker smudged, pressed deep into the page. "The other one." Carl slammed the book closed, his face gray. "We're leaving. Now." The trail back was endless. Trees crowding close, the snow swallowing sound. More than once I looked over my shoulder, convinced someone walked behind us. Davis asked if either of us had shut the stove fully. I couldn't answer. My mind kept circling back to the warmth of that room, the hollow in the bunk, the cup waiting on the table. Back at the truck, Carl locked the logbook in the supply chest, hands shaking. "We'll turn it over to the sheriff," he said, but his voice was thin. None of us spoke the rest of the drive. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the cramped cabin, dark under the pines, stove ticking softly in the silence. I imagined the logbook lying on the table, its cover inching open on its own. And I saw too clearly another hand, not the hiker's, not any hand I'd want to recognize, curling around the pen, steady, patient, writing the next entry. Somewhere, even now, there is a line waiting at the bottom of the page. A space for one more signature. The other one. The wind came in a low, steady groan across the ridge, a sound that carried more weight than pitch. 4 of them clipped together with rope, a line of color against a world already being erased. Snow blurred the edges of everything, turning rock to ghost shapes and distance to nothing at all. Riley in front had the lead, his headlamp cutting no farther than his outstretched ski pole. Behind him was Kim, then Owen, and finally Travis anchoring the rear. They had argued at the car about whether to attempt it, storm warnings on the radio, the parking lot already half empty. But Riley had insisted the traverse wasn't long, and if they roped together, no one could vanish off the side. Safety, in the old-fashioned way, he'd said. The air tasted like tin, sharp in their throats, and each exhale instantly crusted their goggles. They moved carefully, step slide, the rope tugging with the rhythm of 4 people who trusted, tension more than vision. Somewhere far below, unseen, the valley held black spruce and frozen creeks, but up here there was only white, and the slap of snow against nylon. Owen kept glancing at the rope ahead, watching the way it angled into Kim's waist harness. He couldn't see her face, just the bright patch of her jacket, glowing faint through blowing powder. Every now and then the rope twitched unnaturally, a sudden slack, then a sharp pull, like something else had touched it, Once he felt it vibrate, humming faint as if plucked, and he told himself it was the wind. Nothing more. "Keep tight," Riley's voice carried back, already eaten by the storm. The ridge narrowed, though they never saw it happen, only felt their poles sink to empty space if they reached too far left. That awareness made them hug closer to the invisible spine. The snow underfoot shifted to a crust that cracked but held, sound muffled like breaking pottery under a thick rug. Their breathing became the only real proof they were still together. Travis, at the rear, felt the rope press hard against his hip, then ease, then press again. He thought about shouting but didn't. He knew panic traveled faster than reason. He focused on Kim's silhouette 2 bodies ahead and kept pace. Minutes or maybe hours, the storm ate time. Then a smell cut through the cold, foreign and strong. Metallic like pocket change rubbed between damp fingers, laced with something green, resinous. It came in with a gust so sudden it made them stagger. Travis gagged behind his balaclava. Kim turned slightly, hand lifting as if to pull her mask down, but the rope jerked and pulled her forward. The smell lingered, impossible in snow this clean, and Owen's stomach rolled with it. He thought of Christmas trees burning, of wires, sparking of blood. He couldn't separate the memories from the present stink, and then nothing obvious. No cry, no flail of arms, no sudden drop of weight. The rope simply went light for a second, then heavy again, dragging awkwardly between Owen and Travis. Kim's shape blurred, blinked out in the thick snow, and when the wind eased, only Riley's and Owen's lamps showed ahead. "Kim?" Owen's voice cracked. He yanked the rope once hard, but what came back was not her. It was resistance, solid but wrong. Riley kept moving. "Don't stop," he shouted. "We're almost through the wall." The 3 of them stumbled on, every nerve raw. The storm broke suddenly, as storms in the mountains sometimes do, falling away into a silence that felt staged. They emerged into the parking lot, boots clapping onto plowed gravel, headlights of Riley's Subaru dim shapes through the fog. The rope still bound them together. Riley up front, Owen in the middle, Travis at the rear. Only 3. They unclipped, with stiff fingers staring down at the rope that should have held 4. The end that should have run to Kim's harness was not frayed, not chewed by tension or cut by a knife. It was fused clean, fibers blackened, edges curled as though licked by fire. The smell rose again, pennies and pine sap sticking to their gloves. Travis swore softly. Owen touched the end once, and his finger came away greasy, like sap mixed with blood. Riley shoved the coil into the trunk without a word. No one spoke of going back up. The mountain behind them looked smooth, featureless, as though it had already healed over. In the Subaru's cramped heat, they sat with steaming breath and red eyes. Riley finally said, "She was right there." His voice was thin. "She was right there." Owen nodded, but the nod meant nothing. He kept seeing that fused end of rope, the way it gleamed dull under the lot lights. Travis started the car. Snow ticked against the windshield, ordinary again, but the smell clung to them, metallic and green, as if it had followed them down. When they drove off, the rope shifted in the trunk with a low scrape. None of them looked back, and in the rear view, where the ridge disappeared into dark cloud, a faint light pulsed once and was gone. Len spotted it from 8,000 feet, a ribbon of green that didn't belong to the sky. The aurora was up there too. Thin curtains a careless hand had left half drawn, but this glow hugged the valley floor. It slid along patches of snow, and the brown braids of a half-frozen river split around hummocks and stitched itself together again with a seam so neat he thought of fishing line. When it crossed a low rise, caribou below it lifted their heads in the same breath and went still, as if a bell tolled for a species he wasn't part of. He spoke to himself in the cockpit because hours alone make a person into their own passenger. "Ridge like a broken tooth," he said, filing it away, filing it. Oxbow like a question mark, 2 slate shoulders. The panel GPS had thrown tantrums all winter. He trusted the land more than the screen. He didn't drop lower. Wind had its fingers on the ridgelines, and the shadows were lengthening toward that mean kind of cold that eats judgment. By the time he crossed the low range locals called the Painted Kites, the valley glow thinned to a ghost of itself and disappeared. He aimed for gray weather, a strip of hammered snow by a river pretending to be asleep. He tied the old plane down, locked the yoke with a section of broom handle he'd carved to fit, and stamped his boots on the hangar step. The office smelled of rope, kerosene, and the wish for coffee. Mara was there over a map with 2 pencils and a jar of mismatched compasses that her clients could borrow with a deposit. Her parka elbows were mended with webbing from an old strap. She kept hand warmers in a tin labeled screws. People told her things the way hurt dogs show a stranger the paw. Len said, "Green on the ground, moving." And she straightened without surprise, then surprised him by laughing softly. "Everything moves," she said. "Even what we think of as ground." "Not like this," he said. "Not sky stuff." It went against the wind. It acted like it knew where it was going. "Did it look at you?" she asked, and when his mouth opened, she added, "I'm joking, sort of." A group was due the next day for a 4-day loop, and she was in that pre-trip mode where a person has to be 2 people at once, the one who plans every risk and the one who convinces others the plan will be ordinary. 5 clients, a couple in matching wool hats with pom-poms no wind could knock flat, a graduate student named Yusuf whose pack was heavy because principal weighs more than food, a man in a brand new down jacket whose tags she clipped off without ceremony, and Beth, who had been north once before and walked as if she had learned something from wind. Beth set a small recorder on the crate and asked, "Do you mind if I keep it running? Field diary, not a podcast exactly." Mara shrugged. "You'll get chewing, zippers, me saying drink, and the sound of weather thinking." Len dropped the glow into the briefing like a pebble. 2 ridges over, he said, pointing with a finger that had been broken years ago and forgot to get straight. Green, not high, moving like it meant to. Owen, the new jacket man, smiled as if he'd been promised Aurora plus bonus. The couple looked at each other with the expression that says, "We'll tell this later if it turns into a story." Yusuf made a note in a notebook, already soft at the corners. Beth glanced at the recorder and then at Mara. "If you see anything you don't understand," Mara said, tapping the map, "you do not follow it in the dark. You mark it and tell me in the morning. People die up here doing things that feel small." They set out late because the couple went back for the lid to a cookpot, and because Yusuf repacked twice. Daylight had the pale of a hospital hallway. Willows carried the smell of coins. Beth tapped the recorder and murmured, "Day 1, boots in sugar snow, bird too far away to be real." At the first camp, the snow was scoured to dirt in places, bare like shaved skin. Mara set the tents in an L to blunt the night's predictable push. Owen complained his sleeping pad felt like a suggestion. Yusuf admitted he'd brought a hardcover because he couldn't sleep without weight on his chest. Beth kept the recorder on a crate. Its red light blinked like a superior opinion. They ate noodles that pretended to be something else, and the couple, Carla and Nia, counted how many stars you could see without turning your head. Somewhere beyond the low ridge, a fox barked like a toy wound too tight. Mara made a note in pencil on a wet corner of map. Frost heave at the creek, watch the left bank, don't linger near the old cut scar. On day 2, the hills pinched and opened like a throat. They entered a long valley that ran past Patience. Tracks. Fox, hare, and thin crescents that belonged to caribou or the memory of them. Wind tasted like old batteries. Near mid-afternoon, a mile past the notch where the air tugged and let go, they found the bones. Not a scatter, an arrangement. Caribou bones, many, stripped white as if licked by weather. Long bones pointed like arrows, but not toward any place a boot could aim. Some spoke to the hills, some spoke to each other, some addressed the air. Ribs made partial circles. Vertebrae sat like buttons sewn to nothing. 3 skulls lay face down as if someone had taught them shame. "You're joking," Owen whispered, as if the arrangement might decide to be offended. "Who plays gallery? Out here?" "Hunters stack bones sometimes," Mara said. "Markers, thank yous, jokes, this is work, for whom?" For itself, Yusuf said, then shook his head like the sentence had borrowed his mouth. Beth angled the recorder toward the field because habit makes doors. The red light looked rude in that quiet. Day 2, she said. Found a grammar. With no verbs. We're moving on, Mara said. We can talk about it from somewhere safer than a target. And so they did. Because that's what people do when the world tilts. Walk until they can pretend the tilt was an incline meant for them. That night the sky got serious. The aurora poured like river water over glass, and you could hear it if you wanted to. Hair coming off a sweater, sand sliding through a sieve. Beth lay and let the sound file her nerves down to something usable. Around midnight she woke to color behind her eyelids. She unzipped, tasted frost, and saw it. A pale glow drifting between tussocks, threading little pools, slipping behind a boulder and returning, not falling from the sky but choosing a path of its own. It avoided a tent pole and rejoined itself, on the other side. Light shouldn't care about poles, and poles shouldn't be worth the attention of light. She tapped the recorder and whispered, because whispering is how people behave near luck. I'm seeing something without a word, she said. It moves like breath with a plan. It feels like it wants. Mara was already up, feeding the stove-shy heat that kept water thinking about boiling. A guide's sleep is a guard's sleep. She stepped out, saw the glow, and felt her shoulders try to make her smaller. She didn't name it, because names make doors. Back inside, she said, voice low. We look in the morning. Owen came next like a man late to a free concert. Well, he said, glass bright. Look at that. The couple emerged as one shape until the cold separated them. Yusuf rubbed his face. If I see this wrong, he said, I'll never write right again. The light drifted up valley at the pace of politeness, breaking into crumbs and dust, and even the dust made a trail. It lingered by the notch, waiting the way a hand hovers over a door handle. Do not follow, Mara said. Frost made her words visible. Maybe it's someone, Carla said. An emergency beacon. A flare? That's not a beacon, Mara said. That's bait. Could be the old drift leaking, Owen said. Someone could need help. Beth felt the recorders. Wait, that bone box hum. If it's bait, she said, it's been hungry a long time. They went anyway. First Owen, then Yusuf, because sentences crave witnesses, then the couple, then Beth, then Mara swearing softly because staying behind would be the smaller danger with a lie in it. The glow kept an even distance, like a teacher who wants the class to learn by walking. Snow collapsed in handfuls where air had eaten it from beneath. Far ice cracked and threw its voice to wrong directions. They didn't use headlamps. The light wrote its own map on the ground. They arrived at the bones without flourish. Brightness, love's brightness. Ribs leaned. A gust went slack. For a heartbeat nothing moved. Not a strap, not a cuff. The glow poured itself thin around a skull and pooled. Beth felt her skin tighten the way skin does before lightning. We're going back, Mara said, because saying things is offense. Morning can have this. I think it knows we're here, Owen said. I think it's happy about it. They turned. The glow slid to block, not with force but suggestion. It showed them the way back and made that way lovely. Their trough of prints, the knee-shaped depression at a drift, the camp sitting mild against the slope. Then it mirrored them, repeating motions a fraction late, a rehearsal for their leaving. It had learned the shape of them. Back at camp, the stove had sulked out. They worked in quiet, as if quiet were the price. Water boiled, noodles softened. The couple spoke the gentle language couples use when fear and home fit the same spoon. Yusuf wrote by feel. Owen watched the entrance like he owned the view. Mara pretended to inventory as practice for later. They slept in cuffs and snatches. Morning was the blue of shaded water. Mara laid out the day as if the world hadn't tried to recruit them. Distances, slope angle, snack breaks, who would walk middle when the wind cut. Mundane specifics built, shelves inside their chests. They packed. Beth reached for the recorder on the crate. Gone. She checked the pocket above her heart. Empty. That blinking red had always looked too pleased with itself. The absence was worse. "Anyone move it?" she asked, making a voice she didn't own. "No," Mara said. "We don't borrow voices without asking." 2 tent lengths away, the device sat on trampled snow, pointed toward the bone field like a pet who'd made up its mind. There were no tracks. Beth didn't announce it. She picked it up. The counter had been running all night. They walked. No green visited. In daylight, the bone field looked ordinary and wrong in the way tidy arrangements do. Camp early near a low-rise to blunt mean breeze. They spoke about stove maintenance and socks, pressing their words into old molds. Night without apology. Aurora thinned to a scarf. At an hour that belonged to no number, the recorder warmed and pulsed like a small heart. Beth held it to the tent wall. Outside, faint glow thinned and thickened in the shape of her hand, as if there were a second tent exactly there, inhabited by light. She didn't wake the others. She didn't know whether being the only witness would be kinder or crueler. Morning made tea, and straps and faces checked for the gray. That means a person is burning reserves. They crested a ridge and saw their own camp below, the tents from 2 nights ago. They had circled in a landscape with its own geometry. Wind had erased their script. Only one set of marks remained, shallow trenches leading from the bones toward a place with no name. "Okay," Mara said, period, not question. "We go slow and boring. We stay together. We don't get curious." The recorder felt heavier on Beth's chest. "We could leave something," she heard herself say, hating how the sentence shaped itself like an offering. "A tent, food, a trade." "Everything out," Mara said. "We're not animals who pay rent to weather." Owen argued because somebody had to keep the room honest. "If there's a pattern, maybe it requires attention. If we deny it, it can live without mine," Mara said. "My attention is not livestock." They moved into the whitened afternoon. Absence acts. The glow did not come, but at the notch the wind tugged and their bodies remembered too well. They linked hands without comment, heroism by dullness. Back in gray weather, Len listened to Mara's message, wind scraping the handset. "If you can swing a pickup tomorrow, we may cut it short." He called back, got her machine, and slept badly. Morning had no plans. He fueled by headlamp, drummed the barrel with a wrench until the lid said yes, and taped a split seam on his glove. He flew the line he'd drawn in his head: town, ridge, valley, broken tooth rise. The tents looked like white eyes in a patient face. No figures. He made a low pass and committed to landing before he knew he had decided. Skis hissed, protested. Agreed. 5 packs by the common tent stacked as if everybody had agreed to be lighter. A pot with snow not yet water. A spoon standing in it like a promise. The recorder on the crate. Red light dead. He hated it instantly. The sightless Cyclops. In the doorway he found Mara's tight hand on a scrap. Went to follow lights back by dawn. "Stay put if you come early." M. He waited until midday's thin coins ran out and stopped pretending patience. The recorder had been running. 7 hours. 8. He held the little grill to his ear. Wind, his own breath. Then human sound, the shapes words leave. Not. Far Owen maybe? Just to the rise. Names. Yusuf. It wants names. Don't. Mara, rope in the word. No offerings. Pockets closed. Another noise. Improper music. A match struck underwater. Silk pulled wet across. A glass rim. He looked up. The glow was there as if summoned by remembering. It threaded among the tents, domestic as a cat, warmed the spoon until the metal bent, pooled by the crate, and rose to eye height. Polite. He walked toward the bone field because some stories refuse a first no. The light went before and behind, like subtle hands. He didn't find them. He found bones speaking grammar. Arrows turned inward, one skull upright. In a ribs cup, a map scrap. At dawn, the recorder blinked, and green wrote nowhere. The first time I saw the picture, I blamed the camera. Winter makes apprentices of electronics. Batteries crawl, lenses frost, and plastic pretends to crack when you touch it. The card from camera 8 held one motion trigger and one frame, clean as a receipt. 2:17:03 a.m. A man was caught mid-stride with a headlamp whitening his face into something coin flat, mouth open in that startled half-smile people make when they think they've reached company. Behind him, at equal intervals, 5 more headlamps hung at the exact same height and angle, perfectly spaced like marks drawn with a measuring tape. There were no bodies in those lights. The snow below showed the tidy bowls of moose and old, wind-ridged scours, and where he had stood longer than he meant to, a heel-to-toe dent deepening. No other prints in the corridor. We call that run a game corridor because anything with sense takes it when the basin fills. The willows are lower there and the crust tends to hold, and the root keeps you off the creek's slabbed teeth. Moose, use it. Wolverines use it. People who favor pencil arrows on old maps use it too, convinced the straightest line wants them personally. Our cameras fasten to large trunks by green straps and stare into the cut like patient constables. Mostly it's dull footage. Furniture-sized moose, a fox irritated with its own tail, the lightless backs of passing weather. You learn to love. Dull. Dull as a body gotten home. 3 winters in, I'd grown fond of dull in a way I didn't admit to anyone. A slow animal, a smudged nose on a lens, my own shadow bending into the frame when I forget myself. The picture at 2:17 ate a hole in dull. Rook is built like split cedar and thinks in pauses. He calls the corridor a groove. Grooves don't want anything, he said while I warmed the viewer against my jacket. They just make you keep doing the last sensible thing. We skimmed the bowls along the straight and searched for companions. The last storm had laid a thin crust so you could read what committed and what only flirted with landing. A heel-to-toe track showed where a person had stood and deepened the snow, then stepped toward the camera as if greeting someone. No dog, no double, no bent willow twig shoved aside by a second body. We followed the steps a dozen yards and they ended as neatly as if a sentence had found its period. Rook nodded at the lights in the viewer as if they were impolite guests seen through a window. He thought he wasn't alone, he said, so mild it felt like mercy. That's the expression on his face. We work out of a rental with screws through the window frames and a heater that makes the air smell like shirt cuffs singed against a stove. There's a pump station that hums even when nobody is listening, 2 stores that take turns flickering, and a bar where the stew is better if you eat it while your parka is still on. Rumors in a town like ours come with the weather. Light, then sticking, then becoming walls. Even before I knew his name, the missing hiker had turned into a rumor. With directions. Truck at the turnout. Note on the dash old as a grocery list, back Tuesday. A cousin's friend said he'd taken the cut across the basin because the map offered a line like a gift. Don't go past the blue culverts, somebody told me at the pump. The snow gets strange. The snow always gets strange. The point of winter is to make you think your judgment improved and then ask you to prove it. She wore a parka meant for worse cold and stood very straight, as if posture could keep the world in one piece. She tapped a pencil circle around the collar of the basin, then an arrow through the corridor. Shorter. Here, her brother had written in a blocky hand that looked like decisions made quickly. He loves a scale, she said. He likes measuring his day against something steady. He walks fast and talks like someone is late. She didn't cry. It seemed like a skill she'd practiced. When we showed her the image, her mouth made its own small decision. Her thumb hovered over the screen, careful not to smudge, then landed, lightly on the chalky shape of his chin. That expression, she said, voice so still I thought the light in it might start to thaw. That expression means he thinks he did the right thing and the world noticed. Marta runs our data and speaks in careful piles. She aligned timestamps from other units, and the numbers behaved like they had nothing to hide. No drift worth. Arguing. Batteries honest. Temperature steady. We took turns zooming until the picture became grain and then a beach of pixels. The spacing didn't care about our attention. Exactly even. Exactly right. Rook put a finger between the second and third lights and said, "Not people." He didn't mean supernatural, he meant measured. The lab was too warm and the window edges leaked frost like a line drawing. I kept thinking of the lens I could see caught in the wash of his headlamp, the green tin on the next tree. It is a humbling thing to recognize a piece of equipment in a situation where you wanted a person. Search lines went out. Poles ticked into willow walls and came back wet. Radios breathed grids all night like tired lungs. The district posted cautions that mentioned neither ghosts nor photographically persuasive lies, only reduced contrast and deceptive visibility. It snowed a thin, forgiving powder, the kind that makes people believe in second chances. In the IG lab, I opened the image at intervals I could pretend were reasonable. The viewer burned a faint ghost where the man's lamp washed his face like a small polished circle on a table. At dusk, I took a second camera and screwed it to the tree across from 8 so that the lenses faced. I set a reflective rod at 3 heights and walked 100 steps and stood where he had stood. There is a kind of night that behaves like a checklist. The corridor has that personality. It removes what isn't relevant until the only things left are the cold and your breath and whatever you brought with you without knowing. At 2:17, because my brain wanted that number to bend toward meaning, I triggered my own burst. In my frame, I'm mid-step with coins instead of eyes. Behind me, the corridor is only the neat idea of darkness. The opposite camera obeyed perversely and took nothing. When I got back to the truck, a yellow scrape of paper sat under a line of rhyme on the windshield, fat pencil letters denting the fibers, check prints. I followed my own track with the headlamp low. Crisp edges, then soft. No shadow steps. No companion pack. At the place where the stranger had deepened the snow by standing, my boots found the exact same rhythm without me deciding. Back in the lab, Marta tilted the monitor until reflections slid off it and the corridor looked more like a window. "He's not turned toward town," she said. "He's turned toward someone between him and the next post." "Or toward the camera," I said, and hated how much of me understood. The next morning, his sister asked to come while we pulled the remaining cards. Saying yes felt like something I'd regret, but the alternative felt worse. We left before the store lights gave up. She rode the sled steady, one gloved hand on the rack like she was keeping us tied to a longer line. The cold had gone heavy. The sky was a shell without edges. At 6, she studied chew marks on a rubber latch and asked if foxes ever stand on. True tiptoe for reasons that matter only to them. At 7, she tucked a scrap of blue ribbon from a twig into her pocket with precise fingers. At 8, the straight lay ahead, looking like a hallway in an empty office where someone has left the last light burning, and you can't remember if you're the person who's supposed to switch it off. "We won't be here at 2, Rook said. "I'll carry you if I have to." "We're not waiting," I told him, and checked my watch like a saboteur. We swapped the card, tightened the strap, brushed frost from the lens. The unit's clock said 12:43. His sister stepped to the spot where boots always deepen. "He stood here because he thought the end had opened," she said, and scuffed at the snow as if fraying a pencil line. "We promised 1 minute. Want dresses? Up as reason." It nods and says you're being brave. We made a minute anyway. Weather slid through like a low broom. The willow heads leaned one way and then the other as if the corridor were combing them. We leaned without knowing it. "Do you hear that?" his sister asked. I didn't. Then I did, my breath in my scarf, synchronized with something that wasn't me. Lights appeared far down, pale like coins under milk. They rose to the right height and held the right angle and kept the correct space as the air cleared. None of them swayed as a person's lamp would, even a disciplined person. "No," Rook said, so kindly the refusal felt like a hand on my shoulder. Her boot broke the crust with a loudness that felt like a social error at a quiet dinner. The front light answered by brightening a shade. To our left, another light came up out of the air at the proper height. To our right, a twin. Behind us, 2 more joined in. The spacing was exact. The corridor had made a bracket, and we were the item to be held. My mind went cold and clear the way a mouth does when you drink icy water too fast. I put my hand on her, shoulder, and felt her tendons move in the same rhythm as mine, an absurd and immediate proof that we were still ordinary. She looked back at me, and the expression on her mouth matched her brother's, the relief of a person who thinks the world has finally kept an appointment. "We're not a measuring tape," Rook said, steady as someone guiding a child in a dark room. He put his palm on the tree where the camera watched, and the camera clicked, as if the corridor needed the count. I walked backward, popped the strap, lifted the green tin off the bark. The lights did not blink or sway. They were patient the way math is patient. We left like guilty people who know running makes a new shape. The bracket did not follow. Grooves don't chase, they wait. In town, the story arrived ahead of us and shed its sensible parts like a bad coat. Pranksters, miners, cunning fog, hunters stringing lamps. People began bringing us their phone photos the way you bring bread when someone is grieving. Porch lights doubled. Brake lights split into 6. A woman at the pump told me she'd pulled over on the bridge because her taillights multiplied, and it felt like breaking a promise to keep driving. We filed a report full of respectable words and were told to keep to daylight and let the weather do the forgetting. His sister stayed longer than any of us expected. Twice, she stood in the lab and looked at her brother's face without touching the screen. The second time, she said, almost to herself, "He found something to compare himself to. He likes that. He trusts a world that offers a scale." The search ended at the Juniper, and at the place where boots sink, and at the end of a notebook line. The corridor held its line as if that were the only job it had been assigned. Near season's end, with the crust going brown at the edges and the snow sagging like bread left too long, I went up alone to pull housings. The sled could only get me halfway. I hauled the rest on foot with my jacket open to the damp warmth that climbs out of old drifts. If you want me to be sensible, stop here. People prefer the version where I didn't go at night, didn't bring 2 headlamps just in case, didn't intend to count to 60 on the straight and leave with my superstition satisfied. Want again. I told myself a last look would be useful, as if useful and safe were synonyms. I left at 11:40 with a thermos and the green tin in a case. Low cloud dragged like wet hair. The skis chewed grit and complained. At the notch, the engine coughed and sulked into silence. The corridor at night is not darker than elsewhere. It is clearer. That's what makes dread feel like a clinical room. Every edge sharpened, nothing spared, no clutter to hide behind. When my breath settled, I heard the small sugars inside the snow rearranging again. I set one headlamp on the crust beside my boot and kept one on my head. I stood where he had stood and told myself aloud I was only looking. The air agreed with me the way a shut door agrees quietly. With indifference, a light rose at the far, and like a coin tilting out of shadow. It climbed to the right height and held the right angle. I set a number to myself and then another. At 9, 2 more lifted in the proper places. The yellow note in my head said, "Check prints," and I looked down. Heel to toe, deepening in that honest way footprints have when a person delays. I had the hideous notion that looking behind me made them worse, the way watching a pot makes it refuse to boil just to be contrary. The lights at my back came up on cue, equal spacing, proper height, as if the corridor were kind enough to complete the set for me. I held the green tin out like a lantern. On its screen, I was a figure with a bright mistake, where my face should be the corridor behind me, a written line. As the timer winked, the far lights brightened as if being watched agreed with them. I turned the camera toward the corridor, and its small eye copied what it saw with a devotion that made me feel replaced. I turned it back toward myself, and the screen arranged 5 lights behind my head in perfect spacing. So neat it looked like mercy. My heel-to-toe prints eased deeper, though my weight held steady. The clock has no tick you can hear, but I heard it anyway. 2:16, 2:17, a small number landing with complete contact. The thought I had as the shutter breathed was ugly in its ordinariness, finally a repeatable picture. Something to hand to people that would hold still. The screen flashed, the lights held, the corridor kept its appointment. My scarf carried my breath to my ears so exactly on time I mistook it, for a half second, for someone behind me saying, "Each number with me." I did not turn around. I held still like an object on a table. I let the place complete whatever it was measuring. They found the sled 3 days later, listing as if embarrassed. The case was open. My notebook sat where I leave it when I planned to return. The camera was gone. Rook went with the team and came back with a face he must have practiced and still disliked. He unlocked the lab, placed the card reader where my hands always set it. Marta moved the blinds until the glare lifted off the screen. There were images from other units. Moose like careful furniture, a fox irritated with its own tail, long stretches of nobody. And there was one frame from the unit I'd taken off the tree and carried in my hand. 17:03 a.m. I am half turned, my lamp flattening the side of my face into a cheap coin. Behind me, 5 lights reside at perfect intervals, exactly the right height and angle, neat as the lines in a ledger. The snow around my boots shows the old honest deepening where a person stands and then decides. No scuffle, no skid, no punctuation. The frame contains neither hands nor figures, nor anything you can cut with scissors and hold up and say, there. It is a picture that refuses to show what it insists on arranging. If you want to know what I think some places aren't content to mark passage. They arrange it. They take your private line, set it straight, and offer company organized more neatly than company ever is in life. I think Reed, there, I've said his name, liked a world that gave him a scale to stand against and mistook neatness for kindness. The photograph does not lie and the snow does not lie. The lie is how we look at tidiness and decide it means safety. The corridor counts. We keep pretending we're counting it. If you're hoping for proof, my notebook came back in the pocket. Anyone would have checked first. The last ordinary entry lists battery swaps, a latch thawed with glove heat, a complaint about coffee too strong. On the next page, a list appears in pencil, the letters pressed hard enough to dent through. Spare straps, new cord, ruler, scarf. Beneath, a single time is written over and over in a hand steadier than mine has ever been. It says 217 and then 217, and again until the page goes soft where the numbers overlap. At the very bottom, there's a smudge I didn't make that looks like 6 tiny dots set in a curve, spaced evenly, as if the pencil lifted between each. They look like lights deciding whether to be. When I close my eyes, the spacing returns, neat as stitches, and the room waits for me to finish counting. The binders always came back in mud-stained boxes. By the end of October, after the last rangers pulled down trail flags and latched the lean-tos for winter, everything ended up stacked in the resource office in Cedar Valley. The job of reviewing them, season after season of penciled notes from hikers passing through, usually fell to whichever ranger drew the short straw. That year it was Emily. She liked the paperwork less than being out in the field, but she was meticulous, and meticulous mattered. Each shelter along the main corridor had its own spiral-bound log. The premise was simple. Write the date, your name, where you came from, and where you were heading. A courtesy to other hikers, a breadcrumb for search and rescue if things went wrong. Most entries were scrawled in damp graphite. 10-2, Claire, from Franklin Gap pushing to McCready Shelter, saw bear near creek. Or 10-2, Sam plus Becca, rains hell, hot cocoa saves. She read dozens like that each hour, sipping burnt coffee, trying not to smudge the smears of rain and sweat that bled into the margins. But by the third log, she noticed a quirk. On September 14th, Daniel R. had signed at 10:07 a.m., noting headed to Oak Ridge. Just beneath another name, David R., appeared, time-stamped 10:12 a.m. The handwriting was strikingly similar. Same rounded letters, same narrow loops, only the second signature tilted left, as if leaned against a slope. Emily set the two entries side by side and frowned. People, borrowed pens, sure. Sometimes groups signed back to back, but the times, just 5 minutes apart, showed no sign they knew each other. Daniel's note mentioned hiking alone. David's claimed, met no one since dawn. She flagged the page, with a sticky tab. Odd but not alarming, the pattern kept surfacing. 2 days later, at another shelter 20 miles north, Daniel R., 6:43 a.m., moving on. Then, David R., 6:49 a.m., quiet morning. Near identical strokes, the second slanted left. Emily flipped ahead, September 20th, September 23rd, September 27. Always Daniel first, then David. Always within minutes. Always phrased like they hadn't seen another soul. By the time she finished that binder, her desk was bristling with tabs. She fetched last season's logs from storage, dust puffing off their covers. The same names appeared, echoing the same rhythm, all along the corridor. She brought it up at the Friday briefing. The other rangers sat half-slouched in plastic chairs, sunburned and tired from the closeout patrols. "Look at this," Emily said, spreading the logs. 2 names, always within minutes, same handwriting, near enough. One right-handed, one slanting left. "Could be brothers," suggested Owen, the eldest ranger, scratching his beard. "Or some hiker pulling a prank," said Carrie. "Folks, get weird out there." "Sure," Emily allowed. "But the trail spans 100 miles. No one keeps up a prank like this across seasons." The room went quiet. They were used to oddities in the logs, jokes, cryptic drawings, even the occasional paranoid rant about being followed. But a precise repeating pattern across multiple years was different. Protocol said to treat logs as supporting evidence only, never primary. Still, Emily couldn't shake it. She began building a spreadsheet cross-referencing dates, distances, times. The pair's entries almost mapped a shadow itinerary, Daniel leading, David trailing, never acknowledging the other. Then came the call in mid-November. Search and rescue. A hiker overdue at the Franklin Gap trailhead. The name, Daniel R. Emily's stomach sank. She pulled up his last recorded log, October 28th, McCready Shelter. Heading out early, fog thick. 5 minutes later, David R. had written, "Trail empty, visibility low. Teams combed the corridor for a week. No sign of Daniel, no tent, no gear, nothing but his name lingering in the damp paper." Emily checked the latest binders, half hoping the trail of ink had gone cold. But there it was, November 2nd, Oak Ridge Shelter. David R., 3:14 p.m., long day, alone. No Daniel above it. For the first time, only one signature, she told Owen, who rubbed at his temple. "Probably means he just forgot to sign," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Weeks passed. The office settled into winter hush. Emily still pulled the logs from the pile, scanning for those 2 names. Each time she found only David now. The slanted hand grew more deliberate, as though filling the space where another had been. He began adding notes Daniel might have written. "River crossing fine. Saw deer near ridge." It was as if he were writing on behalf of both, in ire. January, while archiving, Emily noticed something new. David's script was straightening bit by bit, losing the lean, aligning more with Daniel's old upright strokes. By February, it was almost identical, except for a faint pressure in the pen marks, as though someone pressing harder than they knew how. One snowy evening, long after the others left, she spread the logs in chronological order. The progression was unmistakable, 2 voices collapsing into one, a duplication overtaking its source. She shut the binders, but the unease lingered. There was no protocol for this, no category in the forms. Just paper and pencil and the suggestion that someone out there was walking the trail, alone yet not, erasing a person without a sound, leaving only a slant in the graphite to hint he'd ever existed. When spring came and the shelters reopened, the first courier brought in a fresh log. On the first page, neat and upright, one name appeared. David R. arrived at dawn. Clear trail. Beneath it, faint as if written over an erased line, the ghost of another name showed through the fibers. Daniel. And in the quiet office, Emily pressed her thumb over the page, as though she could smudge one of them back into being, knowing full well only the slanted hand would keep on signing. The morning air was thinner than either of them expected, even though the ranger had warned about it. Crisp, metallic, the kind of cold that makes each breath sound louder inside your head. Daniel adjusted the strap of his pack and looked at His son, who was already half a switchback ahead, grinning like kids do when they're not yet tired enough to notice the climb. "Slow down, Ben," Daniel called. His voice scraped against the mountain air and came back to him, fractured by the slope. An echo, he thought, though it didn't sound quite right. They were on one of Denali's lesser-used trails, the kind that locals swore had better views but fewer cairns and no crowds. The path cut sharp turns up through scree and loose granite, weaving higher than Daniel liked to think about. His boots shifted on the gravel, sending a few pebbles clattering down. The sound didn't die the way it should have. It stretched, as though the rocks were tumbling farther than the mountain had any right to let them. Ben shouted something. Daniel missed the words. Then half a second later, from lower down the trail, the exact same shout rang out. Not echo, not quite. Daniel stopped. "You hear that?" Ben turned, a little pink in the cheeks from the climb. "Hear what?" Before Daniel could explain, it happened again. He said, "We'll stop for water soon." A pause, then just below them, as if another man were standing out of sight, "We'll stop for water soon." The syllables dragged, delayed, like someone struggling to keep pace with a song. Ben laughed nervously. "That's weird." Daniel forced a smile. "It's just the way sound bounces here. Steep walls." He knew his own voice didn't sound that way when it bounced. It had weight, breath behind it. This other one felt thinner, like a recording on cheap tape. They kept going. The trail curled around boulders stacked in precarious piles, each turn unveiling a sharper drop to the valley below. Wind sifted through gaps in the rock, carrying the smell of wet stone and something almost metallic, like coins rubbed together. At one rest stop, Daniel dug through his pack for trail mix. Ben leaned against a rock, kicking at dust. Then, clear as day, a voice from just beneath them said, "Got any chocolate?" It was Ben's voice. Perfect pitch, same tilt of curiosity. But Ben's mouth hadn't opened. Daniel's chest tightened. He scanned the switchbacks below. Nothing. Empty trail, no movement. He didn't want to scare his son, but the boy had gone pale, realizing the same thing. "I don't like this," Ben whispered. The whisper returned, a second later, from somewhere, hidden by the bends of rock. "I don't like this." Daniel shoved the trail mix back into his pack. "We're moving." They pushed faster, the air thinning until every breath burned. Daniel tried to keep the rhythm of his boots steady, but the mimic kept repeating them. Each cough, each exhale, each small phrase meant to keep Ben calm. It all came back, lagged, warped slightly, like someone learning human sound by listening too close. Near the ridge, the trail flattened briefly into a windswept shelf of stone. A wooden register box sat there, chained to a post, weather-bleached. Climbers signed their names before heading to the summit. Ben jogged the last steps, bent to scrawl his name in thick pencil. Daniel turned to scan the valley one last time, and there, above them, where the trail ended in nothing but rock and sky, something bright fluttered. A knitted cap, Ben's cap. The same blue with the stitched white stripe. But his son was wearing his. Daniel stared. The wind pushed the higher cap toward the edge, snagged it on a spike of granite. "Dad?" Ben asked. His voice cracked. Daniel looked at him. The boy stood there, cap snug on his head, small shoulders hunched against the cold. But behind him, barely audible, came the repetition again. "Dad?" Same wobble of fear, same breath. But it came from above the ridge, from the spot where the extra hat swayed in the wind. Daniel reached for Ben's arm, pulling him close. The boy trembled. They stood like that, locked together, while the second voice continued. It called his name this time, Daniel. A delay. Then again. Daniel. The syllables slid downhill, thick with gravity. He wanted to run. Every nerve told him to drag Ben back down the switchbacks. But behind them, the mimicry layered thicker. Laughter, coughs, even the scrape of boots, on gravel. The sounds of their climb played back in the wrong order, weaving into a chorus that left nowhere to go but up. Daniel squeezed his son's hand so hard the boy winced. The hat above the ridge lifted, caught in the wind, and disappeared to the far side, and with it went the last familiar thing anchoring them. What remained was the voice. Now it wasn't repeating. It was waiting. And Daniel understood, with the kind of certainty you only feel on a mountain, that something was offering them a path. Not down, not safe, but higher, beyond where the trail ended. The thin air pressed in his ears. His son shivered against him. Together they listened as the mountain called them forward, echoing not what they had said, but what they hadn't yet dared to speak. The fog was already pressing down when we beached the kayaks. It lay across the inlet like wool pulled too tight, smothering the spruce ridges and hiding the channel we had just crossed. Marco dragged his boat up past the tide line, muttering about how the weather radio had promised only patchy mist. Lena pulled her hood tighter, shivering even though the rain had stopped hours ago. I was too busy checking the GPS breadcrumb on my handheld to say anything. The track was ugly, just loops and half circles like a child scribbling on frosted glass. We had been paddling steady for an hour, but the device claimed we'd gone nowhere at all. The beach was a long curve of cobble and kelp. You could smell iodine, whetstone, and the faint sourness of fish gone soft in the tide pools. Our tents were in the dry margin, tucked under wind-twisted alders that leaned like drunks after a fight. The fog thinned and thickened in pulses. I could see Marco's red jacket clearly 1 second, then lose him in the murk the next. It felt less like weather and more like a thing moving. We had left from Task Harbor that morning, planning to hop 2 small islands before cutting across to the main channel where the ferry ran. The sound was supposed to be calm. August, tourist season, steady tides. We packed light: pasta, jerky, a stove. The guidebook made it sound easy. But the further out we went, the stranger it got. The water felt like it was pulling sideways. The sun was a pale disk overhead that never moved. My compass needle jittered like it had stage fright. "Look at this," I said, handing Marco the GPS. The screen glowed greenish in the damp. He frowned. "Batteries dying?" "No. Brand new." Lena leaned in. "We're circling?" "Looks like it." No one said the obvious thing, that we should have been able to hear the ferry or see a marker buoy or at least smell diesel from some fishing boat. Instead, we all stood on that beach listening to the fog exhale. After setting camp, I went to stretch my legs. The alders grew tight and bony, crowding each other. Underfoot, the moss was slick, the ground springy with water. I wasn't gone long, just a few minutes inland. That's when I saw the boot prints, one set, deep at the toe, light at the heel, leading into the brush. I followed them a dozen paces before I stopped dead. The same prints came back out, but reversed. Heel marks facing into the island, toes pointed toward the beach, as if someone had walked backward the whole way, I told Marco and Lena. Neither believed me. Marco cracked a joke about Bigfoot. Lena suggested I was turned around, reading them wrong in the moss. I didn't push it. But later, when the fog rolled even thicker and the surf went silent, I wished I had. Night came without dark. The sky glowed gray, shadows without a source. We ate pasta that tasted of metal pot and grit. Marco kept checking the tide line, nervous. The water would creep too close. Lena rubbed her arms like she couldn't get warm. I lay awake in the tent, listening to the water slap at the rocks in slow, uneven rhythms, like someone walking. Sometime after midnight, the GPS started beeping. I thought it was a dream at first, but the sound was sharp, insistent. The screen was alive with movement, the breadcrumb line unspooling in tiny, frantic loops. The little arrow that marked our position spun like a bottle on linoleum. It pointed north, then east, then back on itself. My gut turned cold. "Turn it off," Marco muttered from his bag. "It's busted." But Lena whispered, "What if it's not?" Morning, if you could call it that, was no better. Fog had swallowed everything. The tide was high and glassy. We pushed off anyway, trying to find the next island. I watched the compass. Marco watched the shoreline. Lena watched the fog. Within minutes, the GPS showed us circling again, round and round the same invisible point. By noon, our arms ached. The water didn't ripple, even when our paddles dug deep. The air had the taste of pennies. Finally, Marco said, "We go back. Reset." Back meant the island, but when we landed I saw fresh prints leading into the alders. Same boot tread, same size. "I told you," I said. Marco crouched to see. His face tightened. "These weren't here." Lena's voice cracked. "Whose are they?" No answer. We followed them again, this time together. The moss muted our steps. Branches clawed our jackets. The air smelled bruised, green, and sour. 20 yards in, the prints returned. Heels first, toes pointing back toward the water. We froze. None of us spoke. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a branch cracked, deliberate as a knuckle popping. That night, we built the fire larger than we needed. Smoke clung low, trapped under the fog. Marco sharpened a stick with his knife and kept it beside him. Lena hummed under her breath, tuneless, just to fill the silence. My mind kept circling that breadcrumb line, those backwards prints. Near dawn, I woke to the sound of someone moving past the tent. Not crunching, not stumbling, just a steady backward drag of boots through sand. I didn't look. I couldn't. We left at first light, if it was light at all. Paddling hard, not caring what direction, just moving. After an hour, the fog thinned. My chest loosened. For a moment, I thought we'd broken through. Then the shoreline appeared, blurry at first, then sharp, a curve of cobble, kelp. Wind-twisted alders leaning over tents that looked exactly like ours. The GPS beeped. The breadcrumb line coiled tighter, knots on top of knots, as if we had never left the island at all. And on the beach, waiting for us, was a fresh trail of prints, one set only, leading into the brush and returning as heel marks pointed the wrong way. We didn't land. We just floated there, silent, the fog closing again. The water held us still as stone. Somewhere in the trees, something was already walking backward toward us.